welcome to the Wabanaki lecture series. Our first presenter is Penobscot tribal historian James Francis. I'm Patricia Harine from the Skowhegan History House. For programs like this to be successful, we need funding, we need community support, we need collaboration, the good idea to start with what program to do, and of course good communication. We'd like to really thank the Davis Families Foundation for the granting support we got for a fund. And also, I'd like to thank Susan Cochran, right there, a member of the History House Ad Hoc Program Committee. She's been essential in our efforts to develop this lecture series. She will now introduce the program and its first speaker, James Francis.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you all for coming, and all of you who are on Zoom. This is very new for me to kind of be dealing with Zoom too, so be patient. I also wanted to thank Mark Tanner, who is the minister of this church, who has provided us this place for our talks, and Jeremy Lehan, who is our tech expert and is handling all of the Zoom stuff. We could not have done this without him. This project began about 3 years ago as a collaboration between Patricia Harine and me, because we felt the need for ourselves and for interested people like all of you in this town to be educated more fully about Wabanaki history and culture. And we also knew that we needed that education to be done by Wabanaki people themselves. So we were referred to Darren Ranko and John Bear Mitchell, who both teach at UMO, and they had been an incredibly strong and utterly essential partners in guiding our decisions about what things to talk, what talks to have, who the speakers could be, and also making those contacts for us. And basically everything that we did here in terms of planning this was run by them first, and they had to clear everything that we did. Matter of fact, Darren is the one who finally named this program, and he's calling it Wabanaki Voices Past, Present, and Future. And that was an important little detail. Recently, I was puzzling about how to make an appropriate land acknowledgement to begin our talks, because we're all sitting on an island in the middle of the Kennebec River. And this was an important fishing site for the Wabanaki people of this area for thousands of years. In discussing this with Darren, however, he suggested that a real acknowledgement would be more legitimate if it was developed through this process that we're beginning together today, which is a time of listening and learning and engaging in conversation with the Wabanaki speakers who will be coming and talking to us over the next 3 or 4 months. So today we begin with our first speaker, James Francis, and he's the Penobscot tribal historian and well-known historical researcher and speaker. He studies the relationship between natural resources, place names, and Wabanaki worldview. He recently conducted an oral history project for the Penobscot Nation. He's served as curator for Penobscot historical exhibits around the state and at Harvard University. And in addition to all of this, he's also a wonderful photographer, filmmaker, and an artist. So, James. Please welcome James Francis.
Watch out for that. Thank you for having me. I am going to now share my screen. We all set? Good. So, as she said, I'm, boy, right off tonight. James Eric Francis Sr. I am the Director of Culture and History for the Penobscot Nation. Longtime tribal historian for the tribe. And I'm just going to jump into this because it's a fair bit autobiographical.
Do you get it from your mother or your father?
Do I get what?
Your tribal heritage.
My mother. It's won't advance. There it is. When are you going to come down? When are you going to land? I should have stayed on the farm. I should have listened to my old man. Anybody recognize that? Elton John. It's a song called Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. And have you ever had one of those songs that when it comes on the radio, it kind of transports you back in time, maybe to a place, maybe to that pivotal summer, or even, a first kiss, or whatever it may be? For me, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road transports me back in time to when I was about 4 years old. My mother had gathered up my younger sister Renee, my older brother Jojo, and she put us in a small panel truck, a moving van. My father had cheated on her, and we were living in southern New England, and she had packed up her kids and put us in this van, and she headed north up Route 1. And as we were crossing Tobin Bridge, it was night. She must have turned up the radio because this song came on, because I can still see the skyline of Boston flashing with the girders and her lips singing, "You know you can't hold me forever," a line from the song. And all of that really burned into my mind that moment. That visits me every time I hear that song. And the song is really special to me, so much so I won't download it. I won't get on YouTube and listen to it. I let it come to me when it comes to me, because for me, this is the first time I ever went home. It was the first time I had gone to Indian Island, where I would spend the rest of my life growing up and being a part of that community. Now, there's a fair bit of irony about this whole story. That little panel truck, that little moving van that she put us in, was a Mayflower moving van. And so you get the irony. So yeah, I ended up on this little island in the Penobscot River, El Nabe Menahan, the People's Island as we call it. It's called Indian Island today. It is the southernmost island in our reservation system, which is about 220 islands in the Penobscot River. And this is my mom. And my mom took us to my grandmother's house. And you can also see my grandmother in the passenger seat, just peeking around there. And so we started at my grandmother's house, and my grandmother was a basket maker. She was part of the basket maker community. She actually braided sweetgrass for a living when I was a kid. So she had this special chair, and she would braid sweetgrass and then trade the sweetgrass with the basket makers who used it to weave into their baskets. So I grew up, went to Old Town High School. I was a runner. And you had Indians written across my chest growing up. And then after high school, I moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming, because I had joined the Air Force, and I got stationed at Francis E. Warren Air Force Base. I was kind of fascinated by planes when I was a kid, and so the Air Force was the place I wanted to be. And they put me on they put me on an Air Force base that didn't even have a runway. It was a missile base, big missiles, the MX and the Peacekeepers and all the nuclear things that we protect our country with through deterrence. So after coming back from Wyoming, my grandmother had passed away. I had to make a decision if I was going to stay in the Air Force or come home. And I talked to my grandmother when she was in the hospital, and she said, that I had been given a gift. I had spent a lot of time with elders as I was growing up and learned a lot. I had a real desire to know about history. And so I decided to cut ties with the Air Force and move back home. And when I was in Wyoming, I was really homesick. I wasn't homesick for my family. I was homesick for the landscape. Wyoming is a dramatically different landscape. It's an alien landscape compared to here. My first wife, who grew up in Cheyenne, came to Maine to visit, and she felt very claustrophobic because everything was kind of closed in. In Wyoming, you're 6,000 some odd feet in elevation, higher than any point here in Maine. And you can see for miles. I mean, you could see the Rocky Mountains 50 miles away. Here it's a little different. Sometimes you can't even see out of the yard. And so it's a vastly different landscape. And so something that I really, really missed. So I came home because I missed, places like this. And I was taking a class at the University of Maine, studying history. I took a Native American Studies course and learned about the Trail of Tears, this forcible removal of the Cherokee Nation from their homeland to someplace else. And as I was walking across the campus, first of all, I had a lot of admiration for the Cherokee people who forcibly got removed, because they're still here today and they survived that. And I wondered, as I was walking across the campus, University of Maine in Orono, how, in their homeland, they had generations upon generations of knowledge of the landscape. They knew where to get good fresh water. They knew where to get the food. In the new place, how did they know those particular red berries were edible? How did they know where the water? And as I was thinking about this, I realized that Penobscots have never been forcibly removed. So that pine tree that I was walking under is a descendant of the pine trees that my ancestors dealt with. It changed my life in that moment. I mean, it seems like a little trivial thing, but it changed how I saw the world, what I studied, how I studied. So I read things like Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau he comes to Maine. He's the original tourist of Maine, they say. And he comes here in 1846, climbs Katahdin. 1853, goes to Chesuncook by way of Moosehead Lake. In 1857, does this massive journey with Joe Polis. And he writes in his journals, he writes, "The Indians stood nearer to wild nature than we. The wildest and the noblest quadrupeds, even the largest freshwater fishes, some of the wildest and noblest birds, and even the fairest flowers have actually receded as we advance, and we have but the most distant knowledge of them." It was, sorry, that mouse is not working, by the way. It was a new light when my guide gave me Indian names for things which I had only scientific ones before. In proportion as I understand the language, I saw it in a new light. I saw them from a new point of view. So growing up, I used to go see this elder, and we talked about language quite a bit, and she said that to truly understand the culture, you must understand the language. And to truly understand the language, you must understand the culture. And so there's this kind of cyclical thing. And she talked about Acknowledgement, the birch bark canoe. Acknowledgement, it just doesn't mean birch bark canoe. It means that which floats lightly. It tells you something about that craft. A feather can be Acknowledgement as it kind of falls from a tree. Thoreau tries to hire a guide in 1846 when he climbs Katahdin, but he ends up not meeting him at the rendezvous point. And in 53, he hires Joseph Atian, up there in the upper left, and in 57, Joe Polis. Joseph Atian is probably one of my favorite historic figures in Penobscot history. He embodies a lot about who we are. He was born on Christmas Day in 1829, and we have a long history of Christianity in our community. And he dies a hero in Maine history in 1870 on the 4th of July. And we have a long history of patriotism within our tribe. He also has the distinction of being our first elected chief. We went from having a hereditary system to an elected system, and he is also considered our last hereditary chief, all at the same time. His father was chief for life, and when John Atian died, the state stepped in by way of the Indian agent and imposed a elected system in our community. And Joseph ran and won. And so all at once, he would have become chief in the hereditary system. And in fact, on his gravestone, it says that he became governor of the tribe by way of his father, which is hereditary, although he was elected. There's one and the same. But he dies on a log drive on the 4th of July near Millinocket, Maine, at a place called Grand Pitch on the Penobscot River, trying to save other men.
Natural causes.
No, he dies trying to save other men. So they had a skeleton crew on this day because of the Independence Day, and they shoved off above Blue Rock Pitch, and the inexperienced guy in the bow makes a mistake, and the water they hit a rock broadside in the bateau, and the water starts to tear the boat apart. And the last time anyone saw Joseph Atian alive, he was up to his knees in water, standing up, trying to save the men who had clinged to the boat. 3 men died on that day, including Joseph Atian. Joe Polis, Thoreau considered one of the most influential people in his life, even above Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And there's an interesting quote. So these Polis and Thoreau started Greenville and paddled the length of Moosehead Lake. They cross over the Northeast Carry into the Penobscot, west branch of the Penobscot. They paddle past Chesuncook into Umzuskis, cross Mud Pond Carry into the Allagash, through Telos Cut down Webster Stream into the East Branch, and all the way down to Old Town. 13 days of traveling the Maine woods. And Thoreau writes in the Maine woods, he says, "As we drew near Old Town, I asked Polis if he was not glad to get home again. But there's no relenting to his wildness, and he said, it makes no difference to me where I am." Meaning he was always at home in that whole journey. So continuing on the quote I read earlier, about how the language, he understood them from a new point of view. He says, a dictionary of the Indian language reveals another and a whole new life to us. It reveals to me a life within a life, or a life without a life, as if we were treading the woods between our towns still. Fanny Hardy Ekstrom, a historian from Brewer, Maine, wrote a book called Indian Place Names of the Penobscot Valley and the Maine coast. At the end of her introduction, she writes, "The day is past when our Indian names were the butt of foolish laughter, to be distorted, mutilated, displaced by trivial appellations. All Indian place names had a local pertinency. In recovering the meanings in the correct form of the names, we enlarge our horizons and make home a more romantic place to live in. These old names are the colored curtains which hang beside the windows through which we look back into the beginnings of human living here. For ages upon ages, countless human beings have lived and toiled and suffered here, and we have left only these names." She got that part wrong. You know, there's this interesting dynamic between understanding culture and language, in that sometimes you can even predict one for the other. If you understand a culture enough, you can predict what people's answers may be. You guys want to play a little game with me? All right. It involves a little math, not too strenuous. So think of a number between 2 and 9. Now multiply that number by 9. You should have a 2-digit number. Add those digits together, and then subtract 5. Now, for every number that you came up with, there's a corresponding letter. A is with 1, B 2, C 3, D 4, E 5, all the way to Z 26. So now with that letter that you came up with, think of a country that begins with that letter. Now with the last letter of the country, think of an animal. And with the last letter of the animal, think of a color. Now I just want a show of hands for you folks in the room. How many of you got orange kangaroos from Denmark? What happened? So first of all, the math is all a ruse. You all landed on 4. That's like the magic of 9. And the rest of it is predictability of culture and language. So I'm assuming that most of us were educated in the American school system. And typically, because of that, we tend to go to Europe first when we think of countries. Go right to Europe, and then people, oh, Denmark, and kangaroo and orange just kind of fall into place after that. Sometimes I get aqua koalas from wherever. But there's this relationship, and thank you for playing, that's fun. And just for people on the call, about 90% of the people chose orange kangaroos from Denmark. Space plus culture equals place. This is a formula created by a Chinese cultural geographer named Yifu Tuan. And when I saw this, I, recognized it as math again, but a formula that you can manipulate. So you can actually take a space, an area, like let's say the Penobscot River Valley, and today the culture we see that through is a Maine, Western science, American culture viewpoint. And so we have a certain sense of place for the Penobscot River today. It's got, logging history. It's, was polluted for a while and had paper mills. And then, there was a river restoration. And so that's all packaged as this Western science, Eurocentric, American Maine cultural viewpoint. What if we take that same space, that same Penobscot River Valley, and replace it with Penobscot culture? How is that place going to be different? And that's what we're going to explore tonight. Katahdin. Oh, we're not even on the whole screen here. What does Katahdin mean? Does anybody know what Katahdin means?
Mean mountain?
Huh?
Doesn't it mean mountain?
Greatest mountain.
Greatest mountain. Does that make sense? Yeah. They hear what they said? They says it does for Maine. Now, what they just did is they just mixed apples and oranges. Here you have a mountain that was named Greatest Mountain at a time when Maine didn't exist. That imaginary line that is in that certain shape with, the eastern line from the heads of the St. Croix and, the St. John River and the St. Francis River at the top, giving us those little bumps, and the height of land, giving us that northwestern border. Didn't exist. And just across the border in New Hampshire, there's Mount Washington, and that's taller. So this idea of greatest mountain has nothing to do with how high it is. And from a cultural standpoint, Glooskap, our cultural hero, when he was done teaching people the teachings that he had to teach us to be able to live in this landscape, he left and he went north in a canoe with his dog, and Katahdin became his lodge. And according to us, he actually is in there now, and his family are making arrowheads for a war yet to come. Now, I don't know if that's why we called it Greatest Mountain. What I do know is when I took this picture of Katahdin, I could feel it. There is a certain energy, there is something about that mountain. Something to think about. So in my work studying Penobscot Place, I have found three things. First of all, when we study place, we find things like geologic or geographic descriptions of a place. And a lot of times these are travel signs. We were a very mobile culture. We moved from the coast in the summertime, and then come fall time, the tribe would break up into family groups and go to hunting territories, which have been long time established, and go there and hunt and gather and get ready for the long winter. And they would winter over in those places. And then in the spring, they would show up at places like Skowhegan, where they would wait and be ready to get the fish when they would come. And I was talking to, we have a piece of tribal land today that is near a falls called Basin Mills, which I'll be talking about later on. But she says, I really get a great energy there. And this was just recently, in the spring here. And I says, well, yeah, I think place has, both good and bad, histories embedded in it, feelings and energies. And she says, I have a really good energy there. I says, well, yeah, because it was a fishing spot. It was a place where after the long winter and after, a moon that we just came out of, which is a moon that provides a little food grudgingly. That's the name of the moon in our culture. At starving times, every year. this is a place where they got food, and there was happiness, and there was sustenance. So these geologic and geographic descriptions in the landscape are those road signs that allow us to travel. And they're typically seen from an upriver perspective. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too. Sometimes they're natural resource based. Birch Island, Hemlock Stream. Sometimes they're even land use, like place where we speared sturgeon by torchlight, or the place where we gut fish, or the place we tanned hides. So this also shows up. And sometimes we have oral traditions that reinforce some of those, all of those factors. And I'll talk about one of those too. Oop, going the wrong way. So this is where I grew up, Indian Island. And right above Indian Island is what's called Big Bog Island. It's Kachee, Mugawug, and Menahan, Big Bog Island. And for many, many years, I just took that at face value. And I have a camp on that island, and I spent some time there, and boy, there's really not a big bog on this island. And I really was like, what's going on with that? And then I realized that just north of it, where Birch Stream flows from the north down, is coming out of one of the biggest bogs in Maine called the Elton Bog. And I was like, oh, from a river perspective, this island points right to the big bog. And so it's not about that island, the bog on that island at all. It's about this, where that island is situated within the river system, access to that big bog. Now, there was this other piece of river, which is just north of the airport, this Qualbuck. It's a long word. And I had asked one of our language teachers, well, what does this mean? And she's like, oh, that's that word that looks like that word that's in that song. Yeah, tutuwas. We have a song called tutuwas. It's kind of the pine needle dance, and men would sing it, and they would pound on a piece of bark, and there'll be pine needles on it, and those pine needles would dance around, and they would try to get the women to dance like the pine needles that were bouncing around. So there's all these commands to turn and spin or fall down and in the song. And so I wrote this down kind of like, oh, well, I'm talking about the river here, and I didn't think too much about it. And my Uncle Neil had lived on Big Bog Island, and he used to cross this piece of river. And he came in to, my mom used to run a little coffee shop, and I was in there working on these maps, and he goes, taps it with his big finger. He's like, yeah, that makes sense right there, absolutely. And I was like, why? And he's like, well, he goes, when there's the freshet, when we have a flood, the water flows in one direction, but when it's the regular flow, it flows in the other. Because this is situated onto, this is an island, so the water can flow this way or that way. And so I took this information back to the language person, and they're like, oh, yeah. Yeah, it means we're not just turn and spin, but the river where it turns back upon itself, depending on the season. So field work is very important. Understanding what's going on. I probably would have never came to this. My uncle crossed that piece of river every day. Whether he was walking on ice that was probably not safe to walk on as he dragged his canoe and would jump in it if he needed to, or during the freshet or during the lowest flows of September. So it's very interesting when we get to a part of the Penobscot River, as you see here, and this is all labeled in Penobscot. A very interesting thing happens. All these islands just kind of bulge in the river. You can see letter B is actually Indian Island, or Alnabe Menahan. And Big Bog Island is just to the northwest of that. But island letter C is what's called Marsh Island today. And the back channel of this on the western side of this island today is actually called the Stillwater River. So the state of Maine renamed that back channel as a separate river. And they did it because in the Treaty of 1818 with Massachusetts, because Maine wasn't here yet, that our reservation system was defined as all the islands in the Penobscot River from Old Town Island north. So there was a lot of contention for a long time about what exactly Old Town Island was. Was Old Town Island Indian Island? Or was Old Town Island Marsh Island? Well, the town of Old Town is on Marsh Island. So the state, to quell any debate, made sure that Marsh Island was not an island in the Penobscot River because its back channel is a separate river. So pretty slippery. There's many stories about how Marsh Island was stolen, and this is just one of them. Today it's got a paper mill on it. It's got the flagship campus of the University of Maine on it. So it has a lot going on here. And what's so really egregious to me about the whole thing, by them calling it Stillwater, they have taken the name that we called it. We called it Stillwater or Flatwater, which always really confused me because when you're at the mouth where the Stillwater branch comes back in with the main branch, there's a great set of falls there. And I was like, why the first thing you see would you call it Stillwater when it's not even close to being still? So let's examine what's going on here with the Stillwater. I was talking about Basin Mills earlier. We're going to get in close to this area here. So this top part, you can see the falls, and there's actually a place name below what we called Anthill Island. And it was where the river forms a channel. And this is the first place. This is the first island in the Penobscot River, if you're paddling, except for Verona, which is a very large island right in the mouth of the river. But this is the first time where this can happen, where the river forms a channel. And so it is so named. And so when you're there, you can see, feel, and hear Ayers Falls, which are, you can see it. You can feel it in the current. You can hear it. And so this channel is very attractive. It's like, yeah, let's go that way. And if you go that way, this dotted line that you see over the land here is a portage. And if you were to take that portage today, you walk right by Pat's Pizza in Orono. So the whole town of Orono is kind of on this little peninsula here, or the downtown area is anyways. And it would actually not only take you around Ayers Falls, but it would take you around the falls that were at the mouth of the Stillwater. So you're actually skipping two. And this is really important because as you advance up the Stillwater, you get to a place about halfway where there's an island, and there's actually a set of falls there. It's called Jamison Falls today. But the old name for it was the falls with an easy carry, because it's just a big rock in the middle, and you could go up over it, and then you're above the falls and carry on your way. And as you go all the way up around the Stillwater, you can get above the falls at Old Town, which are here, by one easy carry. Now, if you were to go the main stem of the river, first of all, you got to get up Ayers Falls, which are pretty significant. Marsh Island's ancient name was Slippery Ledge Island. And it's named that because of Marsh Falls, which is on the main stem. It's almost, you get a horizon line when you're paddling downriver, and it's just very shallow, and it's, the ledges there are really slippery. All the rocks along this part of the river are really slippery. So you got to get up over that obstacle, and then you get to the corner where this picture was taken, where they just recently took a dam out. And those falls were known as bad falls at the site of a bad carry. Not to mention the two sets of falls on either side of French Island, and then the big falls at Old Town. So calling that Stillwater or Flatwater is probably the better translation, meant that's the way you went when you were going upriver. It probably was a slightly longer paddle, but it was certainly easier. And all of this information comes from the place name data that we've gathered. And it makes all the sense in the world as someone who spends a lot of time on the river. Now, they just removed a dam at a place called Vesey, which is just downriver from this little map here. And when they did that, they asked for volunteers to come out and chuck mussels. So they removed the dam and the water went down, and then it left mussels, shellfish, exposed. And so a bunch of us volunteers went out and picked them up and threw them back in the river. And my wife was with us, and she actually found a petroglyph on a rock that's been underwater for hundreds of years. And so we were talking with some friends of ours, and someone found the exact same petroglyph at the top of the portage. So there's one here, and there's one here, linking these two spots of the river together. Just amazing finds for both of them. Passadumkeag means above the gravel bar. Actually, it means the place that is above the gravel bar. The keg at the end of this word is a locative, so you're saying at the place of. At the place that is located above the gravel bar. And what's happening is Passadumkeag Stream, which is near the letter A here, is flowing in from the east. And in the east, there's a glacial moraine system out there. And it's been eroding and bringing gravel down the stream to the river. And a stream can move gravel quite readily. It's got a smaller cross section. The water has a lot of force on it. But when all that gravel in the water hits the river, it tends to fall out and create a gravel bar. And this gravel bar is a distinct feature in the Penobscot River. We actually paddled down it several times. Some people in the room have paddled with us through the gravel bar. River changes every year because it's just a big shifting gravel bar. And but again, this is an upriver perspective. And not only does this gravel bar have like a physical identity to it where you can say, oh, I'm in the gravel, but it also has a cultural identity, and that's a perfect place to go fishing. And so in 1820, when Joseph Treat was guided upriver by old John Neptune, they came to a place that John Neptune called Oakwoodgees, or the fish ladder. We can see remnants of it today, a zigzag pattern of rocks and sticks that went across the river, only allowing fish to go through certain spots, and so you could go there and collect a bunch of fish. And a gravel bar is perfect for that. And so as we kind of look at the map here, you got Bear Island. This big island here is Willemon Menahan, and this points back to our ancient relatives, the red paint people, because this is the island of the red clay quarry and the stream of the red clay quarry. And then further down, number 12 is where we have our cultural tourism. We call it Sugar Island today. But that long word there means it was a sugar plum island. It's serviceberry. And what's really cool about the serviceberry bush is that it's also called a shad bush. And it's called shad bush is because it's in bloom in this big white flowers when the shad are running. So for our culture, it acted like this beacon in the early spring to let us know the fish are coming and that we needed to get up river a little bit and get to the weir. Tucked in Lemon Island here, number 9, White Devil Island. White Devil Island, which, for me, it really confuses me, White Devil Island. Because I can't understand how my ancestors knew who Donald Trump was so long ago. Sorry. I did that many years ago with John Baldacci, and he was in the room. And he says, yeah, you got me. But no, that is the name of it, but it's I'm not sure what the history of that place is, but that's always fun. So Blackman Stream, which is a little tributary, it actually means plenty of alewives stream. So again, a resource that's going to be coming there. And I bring up this, and it's Madamuscontus. And so there was this Madamuscontus, which is near Bradley, Maine, but there's another Madamuscontus upriver on the same river, a stream near Lincoln, Maine, called Madamus. You could still see it on the map today. And it means the same thing. And so I just bring this up because it's, these names aren't exclusive. It's, if the resource is important enough, they'll use it again. So we fished by spears, weirs, and nets. This fishing spear is here. It's called a leister or a leister. And we have a story around this, and I really like this story because it's geolocated. We know where it happened. And it happens at a place called Nesawatahunk Stream, which is the stream that flows between the mountain. That's exactly what it means. And it flows between Double Top and like the Katahdin Range. And it's a place where water has smooth granite rocks to the point where people can slide down them and have a lot of fun. And that's exactly what was going on. We have Mi'kmaq, little people in our culture, stories of them, and they're sliding down the rocks at this place. And nearby, a couple of Penobscot fellas have a sharpened stick, and they're trying to spear salmon, and they try to pull the salmon out of the water, and the sharpened stick just, the fish falls off the sharpened stick, and the fish swims off with a puncture wound, but the Penobscots don't get their fish. And so the little people come over and say, hey, why don't you try this? And they teach us how to do this piece of technology that when you spear the fish, these little grabbers, these things kind of grab a hold of the fish. What amazes me about this story is those Penobscots were fishing for salmon in a place that hasn't seen salmon in hundreds of years because of dams in the river. Passasagassa-Waukeag, place where we speared sturgeon by torchlight. So a very specific activity and name for a place. The Hunks and the Cooks. Yeah. I always say that there's a joke here somewhere, and my wife insists that there is certainly not a joke here somewhere. I guess that's become the joke, is what I just... so the Hunks and the Cooks, these are endings of words that actually talk about canoeability. Nesawatahunk, I just talked about it. It's this stream that flows between the mountains. It's extremely rocky. The water's going over a granite ledge for much of the time, and it's not very canoeable. And there are other places that we find on the landscape that have these hunk endings that are coves that are just riddled with, mud and just not very canoeable. Now, the Cooks are different. Sebasticook, Sawadabscook. In fact, Sawadabscook, which is a stream, which means at the sloping ledge, the canoeable stream that's at the sloping ledge, which is in Hamden, Maine, is really interesting because you can take the Sawadabscook And in fact, when they first put a railroad from Bangor to the Kennebec River Valley, they actually follow this piece of landscape where the Sawatapscook goes through, because it's very flat. So once you get up a couple miles from the river, it's broad, flat area, and this Sawatapscook just wins its way through the forest, and it kind of peters out about a mile away from what's called Pleasant Lake. And Pleasant Lake is the top of the Sebasticook, the east branch of the Sebasticook to shore. And if you're in the Sebasticook, you sail all the way down the Sebasticook to Fort Halifax, which is near Waterville and Winslow, and you're in the Kennebec River. And so it's this highway to the west from a Penobscot point of view. And if you think about watersheds, they're kind of like trees. So you have the Penobscot watershed with all its branches, and you have the Kennebec watershed, and they get pretty close sometimes, but they don't touch. They do not touch. There's a height of land between that. That's what pretty much the definition of a watershed is. But these portages are like a squirrel jumping from one branch to another and allowing us to extend just by like a mile and a half, walk through the woods with a guidon, that light canoe over our head, connecting us to hundreds and hundreds of miles of more travel. Very important. Glooskap and the moose. We have a story, an oral tradition about Glooskap wanted to teach people how to hunt moose. And so the hunting party heads out into the woods, and they come upon a very large lake, largest in the territories. And they see a cow moose and her calf come down to the water's edge. And so Glooskap bends down, and he picks up a stone from the ground. He affixes it to a stick, notches it in his bow, and he shoots the cow moose dead. As the party goes to get the meat from this cow moose, they realize that she has turned to stone. Fantastic kind of imagery of this cow moose turning into a huge mountain of rock. And again, pragmatic. The way I think about things is, when you think about it, she doesn't turn into just any stone. She turned into that stone that Glooskap picked up off the ground, affixed to a stick. Kineo becomes the largest, and we're talking about Mount Kineo and Moosehead Lake. Kineo becomes one of the largest repositories for hundreds of miles for stone that is perfect for killing a moose. And that's what the story's telling us, that that quarry is there. And when we traveled in 2014, we recreated Thoreau's 1857 trip, paddling up Moosehead Lake and then all the way around, like I was talking with Polis earlier. We were on a trip, both me and Chris Alexis, who's in the back of the room, and Chris had paddled the Moosehead region, and they had camped at Hardscrabble Point, which is right near Kineo. And that evening, while supper was being made, Chris took some stones and started flint knapping in the shadow of the cow moose. Now those stones echoed through the fabric of time, because it wasn't just Chris connecting with his Penobscot ancestors at that place, Kineo, but Chris's family, the Sauk Alexises, that was their hunting territory for the winter. So he was connecting also with his kin. So Penobscots weren't just relegated their home territory to the Penobscot River Valley. Through portages, we also were in the Moosehead Lake area, culturally, historically, And Kineo is what we consider the cow moose. Now her calf, remember the cow moose had a calf with her. The calf got excited and knocked over a kettle that Glooskap had ready to cook the moose in. And that becomes known as Kettle Mountain, or what is now Little Spencer Mountain. For many years it was called Kettle Mountain, and it's actually shaped like an old-fashioned kettle. Kokajo, there's a place up there, that is very close to our term for a kettle. Almost the same word. Glooskap takes off his backpack and he throws it, and that becomes Spencer Mountain, according to the legend. And then the calf moose runs across the landscape. Glooskap chases it. He's got his snowshoes on. He's got a dog in tow because he's hunting. Always had our dogs. And the calf moose goes all the way to Penobscot Bay and starts swimming across the bay. Gets over by the Holbrook Bird Sanctuary, is there now, over on Cape Rozier. And Glooskap jumps over the bay with such height and with such might that when he lands at Dice Head, it's said that his snowshoes made imprints in the rocks. And it's from that vantage point that he shoots the calf moose, dead. And then guts the animal, throws the entrails to his dog, throws the liver someplace else, and the rump, the liver, and the entrails become travel markers in the bay. So I was kind of curious. I went to Dice Head. I wanted to see these snowshoes. And what I found was that Dice Head, like most of Penobscot Bay, is a gray granite. And then you could see this quartz crisscrossed all through the rocks. Now, I've taken geology classes, and I understand how this happens geologically. I get it. I know from a scientific point of view, and people have asked me, which do you believe? Do you believe that that's Glooskap's snowshoes, or do you believe in the geology, how that happened? And you know, when I went down over that, there's like a lighthouse and a set of steps that take you down to the shore where I took this picture. When I went down over those steps and saw this, it didn't matter how it was made. I knew I was in the right place. I knew this is what they were talking about because it was that distinct. And so it doesn't matter what I believe. The important part of this story is it becomes a travel marker. It becomes something on the landscape that you can say, aha, I know where I'm at. I get it. Same thing with the entrails. So first time I visited these in Penobscot Bay, I was with a former professor of anthropology at the University of Vermont named Bill Haviland, who grew up on Deer Isle and has wrote a book about the Indians on Deer Isle. A book called Place of the Lobster and Crabs. But so we went out in his boat and we pulled out of the cove, and 12 miles away, he said, "Do you see that white dot on the shore over there?" And I said, "Yeah." It was an overcast day, 12 miles away, and I was like, he's going to show me some mansion that he likes. And so as we get closer, realize it's this large quartz rock that you can see all the way across the bay. And it has these lines just like the, over there at the snowshoe, made out of the same material, kind of go in. And it kind of looks like a big pile of moose entrails. Now, traditionally, when we would hunt with our dogs and we would get a kill, we would cut the entrails out and you would throw the entrails to the dog. And that's what's happened here. He threw the entrails to the dog. They landed on the shore of Islesboro Island. And you would never feed the dog the sweet meat of the kill because you were afraid that they'd lose their ability to track the animal, and you wanted him to have the entrails so that they could track the animals better. And the moose liver, which was interesting, unlike the gray granite that's everywhere else in the Penobscot Bay, this rock was brownish red. So it's a very distinctive piece of ledge in the Penobscot River. And when you look at them collectively where they're at, so the entrails are here, snowshoe prints are there, the rump is here, the liver is there, and these red lines are travel routes in the Penobscot area. The circles are portages where you have to take your canoe out of the water, whether it's just for a couple hundred yards, if even that, even shorter here. This place meant a grassy place where we'd have to sit and wait. That right there at the little, what's called Castine Neck today. If you've ever been to Castine, there's a little, what they call the British Canal. That's there. They dug a canal across this little neck. But sit and wait for the water to rise so then you could paddle close enough to get across that little neck. So 12 miles away, we pulled out of here. This is like 12 miles. We could see that entrails, but just not even 50 yards south of that is the portage that takes you. This island's really long. And to know where you can kind of cross it in the shortest point is very important to a canoe traveler. And so by having this little piece of entrails there is really important. Likewise, when you're talking about the liver, this is a blind cove. A blind cove is one that goes in and then turns sharply. So when you're passing by in a boat, you can't even tell that it's even a cove. And this marked where that was. Oh, I'm done. Yeah. Just really quick, 13 Moons project. We painted 13 drums, 13-sided drums that coincided with our calendar, our moon calendar. And each one of them was painted during the time of each moon. So it took us 13 months to do this, or it took me, I painted them. But it was, it's kind of like the same thing. It's the same thing as place names where language not only informs place in this, but informs, what is going on in that place throughout the year. So I am going to stop sharing so everybody can see my lovely face. Are there any questions? I think the only guy with the questions has gone to the bathroom. So should we wait or? Yes, go ahead.
Can you, obviously we're here, the Kennebec is a huge part of our landscape.
Sure.
Can you just speak for a minute or two about the Kennebec? That I'm assuming that's a Wabanaki word, and what place within that waterway that you just described in the Penobscot and up around Indian Island, what place the Kennebec had in the transportation of the Wabanaki?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, the Kennebec is pretty interesting with Mary meeting Bay, and then you got the Skowhegan coming in. Skowhegan is really the place where a lot of fishing was going on, just because of the nature of the way it was situated as it came into Mary meeting Bay. Places like Augusta was important. There was a settlement there. Where Fort Halifax was, and where these tributaries would come in. Cobasacante, so just was that south of where Augusta, that's an important travel corridor inland. All the way up where Norridgewock was. We were just talking over dinner about the settlement that not only at Norridgewock, but even an older settlement just across the river at the mouth of the Sandy River. And the whole thing about Norridgewock and why that village was sacked in 1723 or 4, I can never remember which year it was. It wasn't that it was just an Indian village that needed to get sacked. The French had quite the little settlement there with blacksmithing going on and a Jesuit priest, and And the French were strategically bolstering that little Indian community because it was protecting Quebec City. Because the way to get to Quebec City is to go up the Kennebec, go up the dead portage into the Chaudière, and then you can just paddle right into Quebec City. And so,
Sounds so easy.
you know, we define our landscape here in Maine by I-95, right? I mean, I know the shape, and for me, it's not defined in that way. For me, it's defined by, and my ancestors by river systems. Those were the roadways. And so, the way I look at it is, that is pretty easy. It is, it probably had a lot of rugged paddling and probably some poling, especially if you're going upstream. But once you got up over that height of land, that border, what is now the border between Maine and Canada, is the height of land. Then you can get into the Chaudière River and then go right downstream into the St. Lawrence.
Easier in a canoe than the way
Yeah.
Arnold did it.
Yeah. Exactly. Arnold had a pretty tough time.
Was Fort Knox the same route
Yeah.
from Caratunk over the Dead River?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And we published a map, the Culture and Historic Preservation Department, a few years back. We just hung copies of it in the Moosehead Historical Society last week. But it shows both the Penobscot word for places, and also the English translation is on the back side. And so it's a pretty big map, and it's kind of cumbersome. So we also published a little gazetteer book that goes with it, so you can look up the English and then see what the corresponding, or flip the book over and do the opposite if you're looking at the Penobscot side of the map. But we also, because it made sense, we also included all the canoe routes and the portages. So there's a really good book out there called Above the Gravel Bar, written by David Cook. He was a history teacher at, I think, Bethel or somewhere in western Maine, Freiburg maybe. But he compiled all of these canoe routes in Maine. And when he republished it back, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, I actually wrote the introduction for him. But it's really interesting to reimagine this landscape, get rid of the I-95s and the Route 2s and the Route 201s, and really start to examine how did somebody get from the Kennebec, or from the Penobscot to the Kennebec and the Androscoggin. And a friend of mine who writes for National Geographic is trying to figure out how to paddle from his hometown in New Hampshire to paddle over to here. And he's finding it challenging. And to take that 90-mile journey from the Sawadappscook to the Sebasticook, you think, well, why don't you just go down to the ocean and then go all those fingers of land that stick out into the ocean that Maine is made out of. But every one of those little fingers of lands also has a little portage across them, because nobody wanted to go around those really treacherous waters off the tips of those fingers. So paddling in the ocean wasn't something that was desirable at all. And so even if it was 90 miles of inland paddling to get across there, it was worth it. And remember, Polis says he was always at home, even on that 13-day journey. So there wasn't this whole idea of this sedentary place that we call home, that we were always at home in the environment that we lived in. Anybody else? All the way in the back and then here.
James, thank you so much for it. Could you explain a little bit more about the upriver perspective?
Yeah, so I'm going to share a story about Walmart. So Bangor had a Walmart for a long time, and it was in a certain spot, but they needed a super Walmart. And so they were going to put it in this place that was adjacent to the Pemjadjawuk wetlands. I don't know why Walmarts always want to be put in a wetlands. So there's all this controversy about Pemjadjawuk, the wetlands. It's a protected bird sanctuary and all of this. And so people started calling my office, what does Pemjadjawuk mean? And I was like, well, it's named for the falls in Bangor. No, I mean the wetlands. Well, no, that same word is named for the falls in Bangor. And it means, it's the falls that come into view out of concealment. And Bangor is tidal. And so when the tide is in, there's no falls. But as the tide goes down, then you start to see this, and it starts to appear. And that's Pemjadjawuk. And just above that is this stream called the Pemjadjawuk stream that goes into the wetlands. So what you find in the river is this kind of upriver perspective is that if you have a falls first and then a stream, that stream will take on the name of the description of the falls. And conversely, we have in other places, like Nesawatahunk, the stream that flows between the mountains. So that's a stream that hits the Penobscot River, but just upriver from that is a massive waterfall called Nesawatahunk also. But that falls means, it has to do with that stream that flows between the mountains. So it's named because that stream came first. And so things like at the sloping ledge, that doesn't make sense if you're going downstream because you don't see it. It's visually, everything seems to make more sense from an upriver perspective. Pockwawkamus. See, Pockwawkamus is a stream, it's a pond, and it's a falls. All of it's named for the pond, the top. The stream is named for the description of the shallow, muddy pond, Pockwawkamus. And then after that stream goes through what they call the salad bowls in the Katahdin area, where that original picture that I had up was taken. Goes through Compass Pond and River Pond. Those are the salad bars. And then it goes into the river, and then just up from that is Pockwawkamus Rapids or Falls, and a great whitewater spot. So that's kind of that upriver perspective. It doesn't, any description of the falls, Whitewater Cascade, or any of them don't make sense from an upriver going down perspective. It all makes sense heading upstream. Yeah.
Brighton Plantation, kind of between Kingsbury and Solon, I was told at the time that there was a migration route between Moosehead Lake and the Kennebec River at Solon, which would have been below the falls or something. Was there a lot of, and that once to Solon downstream to go out to Mount Desert Island or fishing in the summer off the shore and coming inland in the winter, or maybe vice versa, as a migratory strategy to survive? Was there inland migration routes that were major established routes?
Like through the forest?
Yeah, as opposed to canoe routes?
Well, so when colonists and explorers start coming to New England, they noticed that Native Americans down in southern New England were burning the forest twice a year. And they were burning the forest for a few reasons. One, they could burn the forest floor without catching the canopy on fire because it's a hardwood forest. And as long as they kept doing that, They could burn the underbrush every year, maybe twice a year, and then the deer would come and eat the young shoots that come up. And it would be for ease of travel also. As you come up into northern New England, you see a lot less of that because we don't live in a hardwood forest here. It's a boreal forest, and you have these conifers and evergreens that go right to the ground. If we tried to do that, would burn the place down. There wasn't a lot of overland travel short of between the portages, through portaging, linking waterways. It just didn't make a lot of sense. Sometimes in the wintertime, if you had to travel overland through boggy areas, you would do that. There's an old route between what we call Eddington Bend that takes you across the boggy area, which is north of Brewer, and you can get to the Union River through that way. But you could only do it when the ground was frozen, using sleds and snowshoes over ground. But the river system is so prevalent in the streams that you would travel in that way. And the whole migratory thing is seasonal. So say everybody in this room was the Penobscot tribe. And in the summertime, we all could live on the coast because there's plenty of shellfish. And we're all going to eat that, and we're going to throw it into the shell middens, the trash and all that. But when fall started coming and the days started getting shorter, me and my family would get in our canoes and start heading upriver and go to our hunting area. Because we can't all stick together through the fall and the winter. It's not enough food to feed us all. So, I used to tell kids in the school that, that I've hidden the candy bar out on the playground, and if they find it, then I'll give them all a candy bar. And I said, would it make sense for you all to stay in one group and look, or would you spread out? They said, we'd spread out. And that's the same thing. The carrying capacity of the land couldn't support all of us. And so we would have to spread out. And like I was talking about Chris and the Kineo area, that's where his family would go every single year. The young men knew where the best hunting was. The young women knew where the best berries were. And they would gather and they would hunt in that area year after year after year, generation after generation after generation, because they knew it. And then they would, in the spring, they would come to places like this to get fish on the way to the coast. And that's why place names are so important with the travel markers, because all of this is relevant. So that's the migratory pattern that happened both here and, it wasn't until, in the history of world and people, it wasn't until, the establishment of agriculture that people could predict their food source, and then, the advent of cities and all of that comes to be. And, from nomadic to civilization. And so, no, it didn't happen here. Not that we weren't civilized, but by definition probably weren't. And it's not this nomadic existence where we're kind of bumbling through the woods and, a berry bush we eat today. It was more that we knew where that berry bush was. We knew when those berries would be ripe. We knew the best way to get there. And so it was a very sophisticated knowledge of a vast, vast area of land. So, long answer.
So was that migration to the coast ease of opportunity to get food that in the summertime, but that did not exist in the wintertime?
Yeah, you don't, there's not enough, it did not. And, and then some people ask, well, why even go to the coast in the summertime? Why don't you just stay inland? Because one, it was a social thing. That cute young lady that you saw last summer, you might want to marry her. And so, and there's a lot of debate about, marriage, and not the act of marriage, because we certainly had some form of marriage, but the debate is whether we were matrilineal or patrilineal. And, what that means is, so if I got married, do I go live with my wife's family, or does she come live with me and my family? And so if you would ask an anthropologist this, they'd say, a woodland culture, then she would come live with your family, which would be patrilineal. But there's a lot of debate within our community about, no, it's matrilineal. And so it's, Frank Speck, who wrote the definitive book called Penobscot Man, said the whole matrilineal, patrilineal is lost to history. And sometimes, it's a very complicated concept, because there are, some people argue that, no, the women, clan mothers, they were in charge. And that has little to do with either patrilineal or matrilineal. They confuse, this, these arrangements with power. And yes, we've lived in a patriarchal society for a long time, and men have had power for a long time. And yes, we had clan mothers in our society, but it doesn't mean that we weren't patrilineal. And patrilineal makes sense to a woodland culture because, as I talked about, when you have a hunting territory and you have a young man growing up in a place where he's learning how to hunt a certain territory, and if he gets married, he's going to a place he knows nothing about. And so, that's one of the things. But so it's also social. Going to the coast is social, where we could socialize with other people, and in trade, absolutely. And then, then there's our Wabanaki neighbors who, the Maliseets would travel up and down the coast quite a bit. And the Passamaquoddies are a coastal people, the people of the Pollock. And then, then you look at the Mi'kmaq. They have the ocean-going canoe. It was designed, looks vastly different from our canoes because they did a lot of ocean travel. So all those things, take into account.
The other thing, James, is that on this river, there was a lot of corn growing.
Yes.
So that those migrations, I don't know how complete they were, because there had to be a certain binding of.
Yeah, the Kennebec River seems to be the line that anthropologists draw about, corn, and doesn't mean that people in Penobscot River Valley didn't know how to grow corn. It's just the soil there just probably wasn't conducive to it. We certainly did practice agriculture in what's called the Three Sisters model, where we planted corn, beans, and squash together, but we were going to leave. And so there's a symbiotic relationship with corn, beans, and squash, that they can take care of each other, and you can come back and get a reasonable harvest. Some people argue about that, no, I've tried that today and that doesn't work. And I'm like, wow, okay. But that seems to be the model. But the Kennebec River definitely, fields of corn described by early explorers, and Saco River Valley, definitely. The Iroquois to the south of us, definitely. So the Iroquois didn't migrate around because they got most of their sustenance from corn, and they could have the yield. And what's interesting about how white early settlers saw Native Americans is they would come upon a group of Native Americans who, say, were practicing agriculture, and the women were the ones to tend the fields. And the men was like, no, white men were like, no, men tend the field. What are the men doing if the women are tending the field? Oh, they're hunting and fishing. Oh, they're out having a good time. So the hunting and fishing was seen as leisure activities, and so this kind of idea of the lazy Indian, the lazy man Indian, got their women doing all the work. So this different worldview persist because of those types of things.
There was a question online.
All right, let's take this one, and then we'll take the question online, and then we're gonna.
So when those families would come together in the summer,
Mhm.
did they conceptualize themselves as an organizational structure?
Yeah, good question, really. This whole idea of tribal groups is basically a European concept. We're Penobscot. And what does Penobscot mean? It's a description of the river at the falls at Old Town, where our primary village was. And so probably not. Probably this whole, our language is so close to Passamaquoddy's and Maliseets. By the way, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, same language, hyphenated. And even the Abenaki and Odanak. So we are actually closer linguistically to the Abenaki and Odanak, which is in Canada on the St. Lawrence, than we are with the Passamaquoddy Maliseets. But it would be super close. Some people say, oh, well, they say, the word for black bear, Passamaquoddy say mooin. It just has to do with berry eater, calling him a berry eater. And Penobscots, we call him a wasus, which means he stands upright like a man. So, but if I was talking to a Passamaquoddy person and they were talking about mooing, I would know what they were talking about. I would know that he said berry eater. And I would know that he is talking about an owasus from my perspective. And likewise, if I said owasus, he stands up and he would recognize that as I was talking about a bear. When I joined the Air Force, I had a friend from California, and a VW bug drove by. And he cracked me in the arm, and I was like, oh, he knows punch buggy. But he didn't say punch buggy. I grew up with this game. You know the game. You get to slug somebody in the arm, and you say punch buggy, and you have to call out the color or whatever. Cracks me in the arm, and he says, slug bug. And I was like, what? I knew the game, but from California, they call it slug bug. Over East Coast, same thing. We knew what each other was talking about, but it's the regionality thing, even in the language. We had an online question. Is it about China Lake?
It is, yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Did Penobscot ever travel to the head of China Lake?
To the head of, yes. I would think so. I don't know my area of geography very well about what feeds. I think China Lake is within the Kennebec River system, right? Sebasticook? Yeah. So definitely, yes, absolutely. And the Sebasticook is it's a name that it has to do with, you can go many different ways. So once you're in the Sebasticook, you can go to the Piscataquis, you can go apparently to the China Lake region, you can get to the Penobscot, you can go a bunch of different ways. It's a very branchy leg of the Kennebec. All right. Thank you.